War. War never changes. Except it totally does. In the last month, we have seen that war in the 21st century is completely different to anything that has come before. But here I'm not talking about the use of technology. Here I am talking about propaganda. War propaganda in the age of social media, together with HD footage of civilian misery to be more precise. In this essay, we will ask two questions. What is the purpose of war propaganda, and what are the propaganda strategies used by both sides of the Israel-Hamas war?
Then came the sound of bugles, the rolling drums of doom, and the streets of Peking were as empty as a tomb. Boom, 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 boom.
What is the purpose of war propaganda? The answer is that war propaganda does two things. It motivates the population and dehumanizes the enemy. If your country is not eager to fight and the enemy is not hated, you cannot win a modern war. However, it was not always like this. Modern war, with its mass mobilization of industry and soldiers, is barely 200 years old. And indeed, in these last 200 years, we have seen that war has become increasingly brutal and murderous. One cannot compare the 70 Years' War with the World Wars, even though they involve the same participants. Our first instinct is to blame the advance in technology for this increase in brutality. However, I think that this is wrong. Sure, machine guns make large-scale violence easier. But the fact is that mass killing does not require high tech, and the Rwandans have confirmed this with their rusty machetes. Large-scale violence only requires a motivated population and a dehumanized enemy. Once these two are present, the killing can begin, whether done with fighter jets or rusty machetes. So, it is the modern way of thinking that makes war so bloody, and these ideas are of course propagated by propaganda. To be clear, in this essay when I say propaganda, I simply mean all means that are used to spread ideas such as social media, newspapers, speeches, etc. Propaganda can be true or propaganda can be false. In this case, I am not making this distinction. So, if we want to understand which ideas have led to war becoming so violent, we have to go back to the 18th century and see how the dominant ideas in politics changed and how this changed war forever. In the 18th century, monarchy was the norm, and warfare reflected this. Since most people were illiterate, spoke a local dialect, and had little in common with their culotte-wearing nobility, it was really difficult to organize large armies, and as a result, wars were limited in scope. War was the favorite pastime of the European nobility, and these wars were fought by small professional armies with a specific goal in mind, normally conquering a new province. These sorts of wars are known as cabinet wars, and can be best imagined as a duel between the nobilities of two countries. A good example of this is the Silesian Wars, a series of wars where Prussia and Austria fought for the control of Silesia. Now, it is difficult to point out the moment where old cabinet wars ended and new modern wars began, but it is generally accepted that the turning point was the French Revolution. In 1972, the First French Republic was declared, a republic that got its legitimacy from the French people, as opposed to the old divine right of the kings. Once the legitimacy of a nation came from the will of the people, it follows that the ordinary people have an interest, if not an obligation, to defend their dear republic. The introduction of democracy, even if it was the democracy of the guillotine, had great impacts in warfare, the most important of which was the concept of the citizen soldier. This radical political change came with the first levée en masse. This is the first modern case of mass conscription into military service that gave the French army a great military advantage in the Revolutionary and later Napoleonic Wars. But the effects of the rise of democracy go way beyond having larger armies because of conscription. Without the democratic idea of the people as an entity, modern nationalism would not make sense. Modern nationalism is defined by the idea of the people as an entity with a will of its own and its own interests. With the nationalism of the French Revolution, France stopped being a geographic region with different dialects and social classes. It became embodied as the ancestral land of the French people with one language and a common identity. Once the people become an entity, wars are not only duels between culotte-wearing nobles that do not concern the average person. These wars become personified as the French fighting the Austrians. Wars become wars between peoples, and suddenly all Frenchmen are comrades, while all Austrians, from young to old, become enemies. The People's War is born. In the French Revolutionary Wars, we begin to see propaganda directed at the average person that called the French to do their patriotic duty and defend Marion against the parasitic, traitorous nobility that must be eradicated, and the hated foreign invader who must be crushed. Indeed, we see the brutality that followed this nationalistic fervor in the region of the Vendée, when it rebelled against the revolutionary government in Paris. It is estimated that 170,000 Vendéans were killed. This brutality comes from the propaganda that accused the pro-monarchist Vendéans to be enemies of the revolution, and by extension, enemies of the people, who must of course be destroyed. Thus, the infernal columns. We have seen this pattern repeated time after time in the following 200 years after the French Revolution. The 20th century was the century of the People's War, of the total war, where nations gave everything they possessed, including their lives. This would not have been possible without the combination of democratic and nationalistic ideas of the Enlightenment and modern propaganda techniques. Thus, the purpose of propaganda, of war propaganda, is to strengthen the love of one's own people and to create virulent hate for the enemy. The carrot and the stick that lead millions into the trenches and wartime factories. Very few people would willingly go to the trenches or would give up their living standards to increase tank production. Therefore, if propaganda is not effective, the whole war effort will collapse. So, trading adoration for one's homeland and absolute hatred for one's enemy is a necessity. The more difficult the war is, the more propaganda is needed to sustain the war effort until you get total war. The love of one's own people is achieved with national symbols that create a sense of belonging in all citizens. This can be observed in real time in the way that Ukrainians have made great efforts to replace Soviet symbols for Ukrainian ones and to speak Ukrainian in their daily lives. The other side of this equation is the creation of enmity against the enemy. The more difficult the war is, the more enmity needs to be created until you arrive at a state of absolute enmity against an inhuman enemy. This enmity is most commonly created through atrocity propaganda. The atrocity might be real, or it could be imagined. The effect is all the same. All sides in a conflict seem hyper-focused on the atrocities that are committed against them and seem almost blind to the sufferings that they inflict upon their enemies. From this biased point of view of the conflict, the enemy seems to be a pack of bloodthirsty animals who must be put down. Once that this is established, it becomes possible to be cruel to them, to shoot their soldiers on sight, to bomb their cities, to starve them, and even sometimes to massacre them. As Schmidt puts it in The Theory of the Partisan, quote, "They have to consider the other side as entirely criminal and inhuman, as totally worthless. Otherwise, they themselves are criminal and inhuman." End quote. This sort of war is very familiar to us who have met the 20th century, and its brutality is also known to us. Indeed, the logic of genocide would not make sense without the idea of a people as an entity with a common will that can be made responsible for the actions of some of their individuals. For example, a feudal lord does not have any good reason to commit genocide. All the different peoples of his kingdom are all peasants to him, and he only cares that they work the fields. In contrast, in a people's war, everybody has a side. The enemy consists of a category of people, Austrians, Tutsis, Bosniaks, etc., that are collectively guilty of terrible crimes, and this justifies revenge. Indeed, the worst excesses of the last 100 years were based on ideas of collective punishment for real or perceived crimes. Modern propaganda extends the hatred of the enemy to all citizens of this enemy nation, and this opens up the possibility of collective punishment. Most of us can recognize this pattern in history, but believe that we ourselves could never come to hate a people as a whole. But you could never really know or be sure until you had suffered hunger, been bombed night after night, or had your loved ones brutally murdered. So, who knows? The thing is that the brutality of a people's war is a side effect of the enmity created to mobilize and motivate the population. The more propaganda is able to strengthen the adoration for one's country and increase the hate for the enemy, the better one can fight. But the price of military efficiency is the inevitable dehumanization of the enemy and subsequent collective revenge. The Israel-Hamas War is truly a war of propaganda like no other. The principles are the same as in any other modern people's war. But the difference is that we are in the 21st century, and this gives propaganda another level of power. When we look at the propaganda that has existed on both sides of this conflict, we can definitely see differences in how both sides use their propaganda. I happen to believe that Palestinian propaganda is far more extreme than Israeli propaganda. Not because Israelis cannot be terrorists themselves, but because of necessity. The Palestinians have to mobilize their entire economy and population to not be instantly defeated by the Israeli military, while the Israelis have less propaganda because they don't need to mobilize much of their population to beat the shit out of Gaza. This is my explanation why Palestinian violence against Israeli civilians is so brutal, like, for example, shovel beheadings, while Israeli violence is so impersonal, like just pressing a button and flying off. This can be further seen in the propaganda itself. For example, some Otzma Yehudit minister caused a big fuss by saying that nuclear weapons are an option in Gaza, and even Netanyahu told them to shut up. Meanwhile, live on Memory TV, Hamas leaders flat out say that the only solution is to exterminate the Jews in Israel and that they will repeat October the 7th as many times as possible. The levels of enmity that the digital age creates are truly astronomical. But why is digital propaganda so different? Well, because it is the difference between an old Playboy magazine and 4K pornography. Indeed, the thing that has radicalized both sides so much is the absolute human misery that has been, in a certain sense, pornographized into effective propaganda. Scenes of the corpses of Palestinian children being pulled out of the rubble while their family weeps over them, or the video of the desecrated corpse of an Israeli girl being paraded around on the back of a Toyota pickup truck. No wonder that both sides really hate each other and are demanding revenge. The interesting thing here is that the videos that most serve Israeli propaganda have been filmed and uploaded by Hamas. Would it not make more sense to attempt to, cover up your atrocities instead of, posting them on Facebook? There, we find the first strange thing about the propaganda in this conflict. Why would Hamas do the propaganda work of the Israelis when this helps bolster their enemy's war effort and will lead to a harsher war against them? In my opinion, this is the exact intent of Hamas. They are not stupid. They know that they cannot beat a country that has 3.5 times their population and 27 times their economy. The only real thing that Hamas can do is alienate Israel internationally and maybe even get another Islamic country to intervene. If I am right in this assessment, then we are seeing a historic first. No country has incited a stronger neighbor to destroy them so that they can get international pity. But indeed, the propaganda war is being won by Palestine. In most Western countries, we can begin to see that the youth is becoming increasingly sympathetic, and Israel is slowly becoming estranged from its once secure allies. In a strategic sense, this might turn out to be a triumph for Hamas, but only due to the fact that thousands of their civilians are dying horrible deaths. In almost all large Western cities, we can see pro-Palestinian marches, and their side also has far more online support. It is not hard to see why this campaign is working its magic with progressives all around the West. Palestine is seen as this plucky underdog fighting against imperialistic oppression. We can also see a lot of support from Muslims all around the world, who are unequivocally for Palestine. However, this clearly does not extend to anything beyond street demonstration and Twitter posts. Almost all Muslim countries are not accepting any refugees from Palestine, and besides Iran, nobody is willing to lift a finger for the Palestinians. While this conflict drags on, we will continue to hear much from the Levant because in many ways this war is not a war for local objectives, but instead a war for international attention. I think that if the world cared as much for the Israel-Hamas war as they do for the war and subsequent ethnic cleansing of Armenians, or the deportation of 1.7 million Afghans from Pakistan, this war never would have happened. Without massive international attention and millions of fans urging their side to continue the war, there would not be any strategic reason why Hamas should shoot up Israeli music festivals or why Israel should flatten Gaza. But since both sides see a strategic advantage in using the suffering of their civilians, this suffering will keep happening, and will continue to be filmed in HD for our morbid enjoyment. Remember that what makes this war different is that civilian suffering is not a side effect. Instead, it is the main objective.